In a quiet Massachusetts forest in 1988, a hunter made a gruesome discovery: a rusted steel barrel, and inside, the body of a young woman. With no name and no leads, she became a ghost, known only as the Lady in the Barrel. For over 30 years, her case went cold, her identity a mystery buried in a forgotten file. But a single piece of evidence from the scene held a genetic secret, waiting decades for technology to finally unlock it. What happened on that long-forgotten day in 1988 would set in motion a chain of events that would take decades to unravel, leading investigators not just to a name, but to a killer who had been hiding in plain sight. Before we dive into the full story, don't forget to subscribe to Afterlight Cases and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on how justice is brought to light. Chapter 1. A Grim Discovery. The autumn of 1988 was a season of quiet decay in the forgotten corners of western Massachusetts. In the small towns that dotted the edges of the vast state forests, the air carried the sharp, sweet scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It was a time of transition. The last remnants of the region's industrial might had rusted into silence, leaving behind a proud, hard-working people who looked to the land for their identity. They were mill workers, farmers, and hunters. Men and women who understood the rhythms of the seasons and the deep, abiding silence of the ancient woods. The forests were their sanctuary and their larder, a place of profound beauty that held a darkness all its own. On a crisp Saturday morning in late October, Frank Miller pulled his aging Ford pickup to the side of a gravel access road bordering the Granby State Forest. At 67, Frank was a man made of the same tough, unyielding material as the surrounding Berkshire Hills. He'd hunted these woods since he was a boy, taught by a father who could read a deer trail in the mud like a line of scripture. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his breath pluming in the cold air as he slung his rifle over his shoulder. The woods were waking up around him, the chirps of chickadees cutting through the silence, the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. To Frank, this was church. He pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel, the familiar path obscured by a fresh fall of leaves. He was tracking a set of prints he'd seen earlier in the week, belonging to a large buck that had been eluding him all season. For hours, he moved deeper into the woods, his focus absolute, his senses tuned to the subtle language of the forest. The sun climbed higher, casting long skeletal shadows through the bare trees. It was nearing midday when he decided to cut through a less-traveled gully, a place he usually avoided because of the thick, thorny brush. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't the color that caught his eye, but the shape. A perfect, unnatural cylinder in a world of chaotic, organic growth. About 50 yards off the game trail, half swallowed by brambles and a decade of forest debris, stood a single, 55-gallon steel barrel. It was rusted a deep, angry orange, its surface pitted and scarred by years of exposure to the unforgiving New England weather. Frank paused, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Illegal dumping was a plague in these woods. People would drive their trucks out to these remote spots at night to discard old appliances, construction waste, anything to avoid a trip to the landfill. It was a lazy, disrespectful act that always soured his mood. He cautiously made his way towards it, the leaves crunching loudly under his boots. As he got closer, he could see the barrel was heavy-duty, the kind used for industrial chemicals or oils. He figured it was probably full of something toxic, a thought that angered him even more. He circled it, noticing the lid was still on, though not perfectly sealed. A thick layer of rust fused it to the rim in most places, but one edge was slightly bent, leaving a small, dark gap. He gave the barrel a hard shove. It barely budged. It was heavy, unusually heavy, not just filled with trash, but with something dense, something solid. It was then that he noticed the smell. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the rich, loamy scent of the forest floor. But it was there, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that was profoundly out of place. It was the smell of decay, but not the clean, earthy decay of leaves and wood. It was something else, something foul. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He'd been a hunter his whole life. He knew the smell of a dead animal. This was different. His curiosity now mixed with a growing sense of dread. He found a sturdy fallen branch to use as a lever. He wedged the end of it into the small gap in the lid and pushed down with all his weight. The rusted metal groaned in protest. He pushed harder, his muscles straining, until with a final percussive crack, a section of the lid broke free and bent upwards. Frank recoiled, dropping the branch. The smell that erupted from the barrel was overwhelming, a putrid wave that hit him with physical force, making him gag and his eyes water. He forced himself to look. Peering into the dark, cramped space, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It was a confusing jumble of rotted fabric, dark, compressed material, and something pale and unnervous that gleamed faintly in the dappled sunlight. He saw the curve of what looked like a bone. Then, tangled in the mess, he saw it. A long, matted hank of dark brown hair. The image burned itself into his mind. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't trash. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the leafy ground. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran until his lungs burned, his mind a whirlwind of horror. When he finally burst out of the woods and onto the gravel road where his truck was parked, he was gasping for air. The ghastly image from the barrel seared into his memory. He fumbled with his keys, started the engine with a roar, and sped away, leaving the silent, lonely woods to guard its horrific secret for just a little while longer. The call he would make from a payphone at a gas station 10 miles down the road would summon a different kind of hunter to these woods. Men who would soon discover that the ghost in the barrel was real, and that her story had just begun. Chapter 2. Chasing a Ghost. By the time the first Massachusetts State Police cruisers crunched to a halt on the gravel access road, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the autumn sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The forest, which had been a place of quiet solitude for Frank Miller, was now a tense, methodical crime scene. The air, once crisp and clean, felt heavy, charged with the grim reality of the discovery. Lead Detective Robert Walsh, a 20-year veteran with tired eyes and a demeanor that had been hardened by years of confronting the worst of human nature, coordinated the response. His team moved with a practiced efficiency, their voices low and professional, as they stretched yellow tape between the ancient oaks, creating a sterile, temporary bubble of order in the heart of the chaotic wilderness. The world of the investigation shrank to the 50-square-yard patch of ground around the barrel. Every snapped twig, every disturbed patch of leaves was photographed, catalogued, and scrutinized. But the forest floor, washed clean by seasons of rain and snow, offered up no secrets. There were no clear tire tracks on the overgrown path, no distinct footprints in the soft earth, no discarded cigarette butts or scraps of evidence. The killer had been a ghost, leaving behind nothing but his horrific final statement. The rusted steel drum and its tragic occupant. The barrel itself became the primary piece of evidence. It was carefully photographed from every angle before being sealed and painstakingly carried out of the woods by a team of 6 officers, its immense weight a somber testament to the horror it contained. Back in the sterile, white-tiled environment of the State Medical Examiner's office, the true, heartbreaking work began. A forensic anthropologist was tasked with giving a voice to the silent remains. Through hours of meticulous examination, a fragmented picture of a life began to emerge. The victim was female, Caucasian, likely between the ages of 18 and 24. She stood approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall. Her dark brown hair, preserved by the anaerobic environment inside the sealed drum, was shoulder length. Examination of her skeleton revealed a long-healed fracture on her left clavicle, a childhood injury that should have been a marker, a memory in a doctor's file somewhere. Her dental work was unique. She had a distinctive porcelain crown on an upper bicuspid, a piece of work that a dentist would surely remember. These were the puzzle pieces, the individual markers of an identity that, for now, remained agonizingly out of reach. The few items found with her were laid out on a sterile table, each one a potential clue that led nowhere. The remnants of a denim jacket, its brand long since rotted away, a simple, silver-plated chain necklace, the kind that could have been purchased at any department store in America. The barrel itself was a dead end. Its manufacturing marks indicated it was one of tens of thousands produced by a factory in New Jersey that had been shuttered since 1982. It was a needle in a nationwide haystack, with no physical evidence pointing to a suspect. The investigation turned into a desperate race to identify the victim herself. She was the key. If they could find her name, they could unlock her world, her friends, her family, her work, and somewhere in that life, her killer. Detective Walsh and his team launched a full-scale media campaign. They held a press conference, the flashbulbs of the cameras reflecting in Walsh's weary eyes as he pleaded with the public for help. But their most powerful tool was the work of a forensic artist. Using the victim's skull as a guide, the artist painstakingly applied clay, layer by layer, slowly rebuilding the muscles, tissues, and skin. Over days, a face emerged from the bone. A young woman with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a hauntingly neutral expression. This clay bust was then used to create a series of detailed pencil sketches. That face was sent to every police department and newspaper in New England and beyond. It stared out from the evening news in Boston, from the pages of the Hartford Courant, from flyers tacked to bulletin boards in bus stations and community centers. The sketch of the nameless woman from the barrel became a silent guest in thousands of homes. The tip lines rang. Calls came in from anxious parents whose daughters had run away, from people who thought the face looked like a former neighbor or a co-worker who had suddenly quit her job. Detective Walsh and his team chased down every single lead with dogged determination. They cross-referenced missing person files from every state, spent countless hours trying to match dental records, and drove hundreds of miles to interview potential family members. But each lead ended in disappointment, each hopeful thread unraveled. The woman in the sketch matched no one. It was as if she had never existed at all. As the fall of 1988 bled into a bleak winter, the investigation slowed to a halt. The ghost they were chasing remained just out of reach, her name a secret the world seemed determined to keep. Chapter 3. A Nameless Grave. The winter of 1988 was long and unforgiving in western Massachusetts. A heavy blanket of snow covered the forest floor, burying the spot where the barrel had been found, and a deep, penetrating cold seemed to settle over the investigation itself. By the time the first spring thaw arrived, Detective Walsh and his team had exhausted every possible lead. The face in the sketch remained a stranger. The dental records matched no one in any database. The young woman from the barrel was a ghost in the system. An anomaly, with no past and no future. The tip lines had fallen silent, and the relentless pressure of new cases, new crimes, and new victims pulled the department's resources away from the mystery that had no name. In April of 1989, a small quiet ceremony was held at a town cemetery. There was no family to mourn, no friends to share memories. There were only a handful of attendees: Detective Walsh, a few other officers who had worked the case, a town clerk, and a priest who offered a generic prayer for a soul known only to God. They stood at a distance as the simple pine coffin was lowered into the earth. The headstone that would be placed there was a small flat granite marker, cold and impersonal. It didn't bear a name. It bore a case number and a single stark phrase: Jane Doe, found 1988. With that, the official search for her identity was over. The woman who had been violently erased from life was now officially erased from the record of the living. The world moved on. The last years of the 1980s gave way to the cultural shift of the 1990s. The Berlin Wall fell. The digital age began its slow, inexorable creep into daily life, and the rhythms of the small towns in Massachusetts continued unchanged. The case file, once a fixture on Detective Walsh's desk, was moved to a filing cabinet in the records room. It was a thick, heavy manila folder, filled with hundreds of pages of dead-end reports, witness statements that led nowhere, and the haunting photocopied face of the woman they could not name. Each year, it was pushed further back in the drawer, a physical manifestation of a fading memory. For years, Detective Walsh kept a copy of the sketch pinned to the corkboard above his desk, a silent, daily reminder of the one case he couldn't let go of, the one ghost he couldn't put to rest. He'd look at it during quiet moments, wondering who she was, who her family was, and if they were still out there somewhere, waiting for a daughter who would never come home. In 1998, after 30 years on the force, Detective Walsh retired. He packed up his desk, and the sketch was the last thing he took down. He passed the file to a new generation of detectives, young men who only knew the lady in the barrel as a piece of department lore, a cold case among dozens of others. The folder was eventually moved from the cabinet to a box, and the box was sent down to a climate-controlled archive in the basement of the station, a library of forgotten tragedies. The new millennium arrived. The world wrestled with the anxieties of Y2K, the horror of 9/11, and the explosion of the internet. Society was now connected in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1988. People could find long-lost friends on social media, trace their ancestry online, and access information from around the globe in an instant. But for the woman in the nameless grave, all this progress meant nothing. She remained just as lost, just as anonymous, as she was on the day she was found. Up in Granby, the story of the discovery in the woods began to change. It was no longer a fresh, terrifying crime, but a piece of local folklore. It became a ghost story. A cautionary tale whispered among teenagers who dared each other to visit the gully where the barrel was found. The lady in the barrel ceased to be a person. She became a myth, a local legend, as much a part of the landscape as the covered bridges and stone walls that dotted the countryside. Her real, human tragedy, the story of her life and the violence of her death, was almost completely buried under the weight of 3 decades of silence. She was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten. Chapter 4: The Science of Hope. The world in 2022 was a place Detective Robert Walsh would have scarcely recognized. It was a world connected by an invisible web of data, where the answer to almost any question was a few keystrokes away, and the secrets of the human genome were being unlocked at a breathtaking pace. In the decades that had passed since the lady in the barrel was lowered into her nameless grave, forensic science had undergone a revolution. DNA, once a novel and cumbersome tool, had become the definitive language of identification, capable of speaking for victims who had long been silenced by time and violence. In a small, brightly lit office in Boston, Detective Julian Hayes of the Massachusetts State Police Unsolved Crimes Unit opened a file that was older than he was. At 38, Hayes was part of a new breed of investigator, one who understood that the most powerful weapon in solving the past was the technology of the future. He had grown up in Western Massachusetts, and the legend of the lady in the barrel was a piece of local lore he'd known since childhood, a ghost story that had always felt tragically real. When his unit secured a new federal grant to apply forensic genealogy to the state's most stubborn John and Jane Doe cases, that old ghost story was the first one he sought out. He unboxed the original case file, its pages yellowed and brittle. He saw the haunting, photocopied face of the woman in the sketch. He read the reports filled with dead ends and the palpable frustration of the original investigators. To Hayes, this wasn't just a cold case. It was an abdication of the most fundamental duty of law enforcement, to give a victim back her name. Armed with the new grant, he spent weeks drafting the legal petitions and scientific justifications necessary to do something that had never been done for this forgotten woman, to disturb her final resting place in the hope of finally giving her peace. On a cold, grey morning in the spring of 2022, a small, quiet operation unfolded in the same town cemetery where she had been buried 33 years earlier. A white forensics tent was erected over the small plot, a stark modern intrusion in the quiet field of weathered headstones. Under the supervision of a judge and a team from the medical examiner's office, the simple granite marker that read Jane Doe, 1988, was carefully lifted from the ground. The work was slow and reverent. The earth was removed layer by layer until finally the time-worn coffin was revealed. As it was raised into the daylight, a hushed silence fell over the team. They were not just recovering evidence, they were recovering a person, a life that had been violently stolen and then completely erased. The remains were transported to the state forensics lab, where they were met by Dr. Anya Sharma, a leading forensic anthropologist. The high-stakes gamble could now begin. Dr. Sharma explained the immense challenge to Detective Hayes. After more than 3 decades in the ground, the DNA in most of the skeletal remains would be severely degraded, fragmented, and contaminated by bacteria and fungi from the soil. There would likely be only one chance to get a usable sample. Their best hope, she explained, lay in targeting the petrous bone, a dense, pyramid-shaped part of the skull behind the ear, which is known to be the best preserver of endogenous DNA in the human body. With the precision of a surgeon, a technician drilled into the bone, extracting a tiny amount of bone powder, barely a spoonful. This precious dust, the last physical remnant of the nameless woman's biological identity, was sealed in a sterile container. It was carefully packaged and sent overnight to a specialized private lab in Texas, a facility that used next-generation sequencing to rebuild DNA profiles from even the most degraded and fragmented samples. As the courier's vehicle pulled away, A profound sense of anticipation and anxiety settled over the team. Everything, the grant, the exhumation, the decades of silence, all came down to this. The work was done. Now all they could do was wait. They had asked the bones to speak. The question that hung in the air was, after 34 years, would they have anything left to say? Chapter 5. A Name at Last. Back in Boston, the days turned into weeks. For Detective Julian Hayes, the waiting was an agony of suspense. The entire case, the culmination of a 34-year-old mystery, now rested on the outcome of a process happening in a lab 1,000 miles away. He and his team continued their work on other cases, but the ghost from Granby was a constant, silent presence in the office. They had brought her back into the light, and now they could do nothing but wait for science to give her a voice. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, an email landed in Detective Hayes' inbox. The subject line contained just 3 words: "Profile upload ready." The lab in Texas had succeeded. Against all odds, they had painstakingly stitched together enough fragments of degraded DNA from the bone powder to build a viable genetic profile. It wasn't a complete sequence, but it was more than enough. This profile was a digital ghost, a string of code representing a life that had been violently extinguished. That code was then uploaded to a secure portal and entered into a public genealogical database. This wasn't a criminal database like CODIS. It was a vast crowdsourced library of DNA voluntarily uploaded by millions of ordinary people, searching for distant relatives and charting their family histories. The hope was that somewhere in that sea of genetic information, a distant cousin, a great aunt, or a second cousin twice removed of the nameless woman had also uploaded their DNA, creating a single vital link to the past. The search algorithm ran for hours, comparing the Jane Doe's profile against millions of others. The first pass yielded nothing. Then, a forensic genealogist, a specialist contracted for the case named Dr. Evelyn Reed, began to broaden the parameters. She was looking for smaller segments of shared DNA, the faint genetic echoes that connect distant relatives. And then she found it. Not a sibling or a parent, but a faint, statistically significant match. It was a man in Oregon who shared a set of great-great-grandparents with the Jane Doe. He was her third cousin. It was a fragile, tenuous link. But for Dr. Reed, it was the thread she could use to weave an entire history. Working from her office, surrounded by digital archives of public records, Dr. Reed began the painstaking work of what is known as reverse genealogy. She built a massive family tree, starting with the third cousin in Oregon and working backward to identify their shared ancestors. A couple who had married in Ireland in the 1890s and immigrated to Massachusetts. Then, she began the even more arduous task of tracing every single one of their descendants forward through time. Using census data, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, she built a sprawling dynasty of hundreds of names, a complex web of lives that branched out across the 20th century. Methodically, she began to eliminate branches of the family. Some had no female children. Others had moved out of New England long before 1988. Slowly, over weeks of relentless, meticulous research, the focus narrowed. It came down to one branch of the family, a man who had 4 daughters and had lived in the Springfield, Massachusetts area in the 1970s and 80s. Dr. Reed found public records for 3 of those daughters. They were alive and accounted for, but the 4th daughter was a ghost. Her records were plentiful: a birth certificate, school records, a driver's license, until the summer of 1988. After that, she vanished from all official documentation. Her name was Arlene Corrigan. She would have been 23 years old. Dr. Reed forwarded the name to Detective Hayes with a cautious but confident note: high probability investigative lead. Hayes stared at the name on his screen. Arlene Corrigan. For the first time in 34 years, the ghost had a possible name. Using old public records, he found a phone number for one of Arlene's sisters, a woman named Sheila, now in her late 60s and living in a quiet suburb south of Boston. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decades-long mystery pressing down on him, and made the call. An elderly woman's voice answered. Hayes identified himself and gently explained he was with the Unsolved Crimes Unit, working on a very old case. "I was wondering, ma'am," he began, his voice soft, "if you had a sister named Arlene." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Arlene." Sheila's voice was filled with a confusion that spanned decades. My God, I haven't heard that name in years. Yes, she's my baby sister. What is this about? Hayes listened as Sheila told a story of a vibrant, rebellious, but kind-hearted young woman who, after a falling out with the family in 1988, had announced she was leaving to start a new life. They never heard from her again. They had assumed she was happy somewhere, that she simply didn't want to be found. They had never reported her missing. With a heavy heart, Hayes explained the possibility that Arlene's journey had ended not long after it began. A few days later, a detective met with Sheila who, with trembling hands, provided a DNA sample. It was sent for immediate comparison. The results came back in less than 48 hours. It was a definitive familial match. The ghost in the system, the sketch on the flyer, the number on the gravestone, all coalesced into a single, tragic identity. After 34 years of silence, the lady in the barrel had her name back. She was Arlene Corrigan. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Vanished. She was no longer a case number, a cold statistic in a forgotten file. She was no longer a clay reconstruction or a ghost haunting a rusted barrel in a lonely forest. She was Arlene Corrigan, and for the first time in 34 years, she had a story. For more than 3 decades, that story had been silenced, violently erased, and then buried under the slow, heavy accumulation of seasons. But now, through the fractured, grief-laden memories of her surviving family, the woman who had vanished began to re-emerge, piece by painful piece. Her sister Sheila, a woman who had carried a silent, undefined sorrow for most of her adult life, was the keeper of that story. In the quiet of her living room, surrounded by the photographs of a life that had moved on, she opened the door to a past that had been locked away for a generation. Arlene, she explained, was the baby of the family, the youngest of 4 sisters born into a hard-working, blue-collar Irish Catholic family in Springfield. She had all the fire, light, and stubborn complexity that came with her position. She was the one who could charm her father into letting her stay out past curfew, and the one who would argue with her mother over the length of her skirts. She was the free spirit in a family of pragmatists. While her sisters followed more traditional paths of marriage and steady jobs, Arlene was a dreamer. She listened to The Cure and the Smiths on her Walkman, at a volume that shook the thin walls of their small house, and she wore her faded, ripped denim jacket like a suit of armor against a world she felt was too small for her. Her bedroom walls were a collage of images torn from magazines, the skyline of New York City, portraits of artists like Warhol and Basquiat, and moody black and white photographs of the East Village. That was her goal, her obsession. She wanted to be an artist, to live a life that was loud and creative, and a million miles away from the predictable rhythms of her hometown. She sketched constantly, filling notepad after notepad with charcoal drawings of faces she saw on the bus, of the gnarled trees in the local park, of the weary expressions of the regulars at the diner where she worked. She had a laugh, Sheila recalled with a sad smile that was loud and uninhibited and could fill the entire house. But beneath the vibrant, restless exterior, there was a deep well of sensitivity and a fierce, almost painful loyalty to her family. She felt trapped between 2 worlds, the deep, unshakable love she had for her family, and the desperate, all-consuming need to break free and discover who she was meant to be. It was a tension that defined her, and it was a tension that was reaching its breaking point in the summer of 1988. That summer, Arlene was working double shifts at the Springfield Grill, a classic roadside diner, saving every dollar she could for her escape to New York. Her life was a complicated, tangled web of dreams and frustrations. The biggest complication was Richard Peterson. She had met him a year earlier, and at first he seemed charming, a handsome, slightly older man who showered her with attention. But the family, especially Sheila, had been wary of him from the start. His charm had a sharp, possessive edge. He would show up at the diner during her shifts, not to eat, but to sit at the counter and just watch her, his gaze tracking her every move, a quiet, simmering jealousy in his eyes if she smiled too long at a customer. He hated her talk of New York, Sheila remembered. He saw her dream not as an ambition to be supported, but as a personal rejection of him. He would belittle her art, calling it a silly hobby, and try to convince her that the only life she needed was with him. In Springfield, their relationship was a turbulent cycle of passionate highs and explosive arguments. Arlene, independent and fiery, would break up with him, only for him to win her back with grand apologies and promises to change. The final breakup occurred just a few weeks before she disappeared. Sheila remembered Arlene coming home one night, her eyes red from crying, but also filled with a new, steely resolve. She had ended it for good, she said. She was done with his control, his jealousy, and his attempts to shrink her world. She was finally free to focus on her plan. The family was relieved, but Rick Peterson, they would later learn, did not let go so easily. The last time Sheila saw her sister alive was on a humid, oppressive Sunday afternoon in late July. The family had gathered for a barbecue in their parents' backyard. It was the kind of ordinary family get-together that should have been forgotten, but instead, it became a moment frozen in time. A memory replayed 1,000 times over in Sheila's mind. The argument started over something trivial, but it quickly spiraled into the central conflict of Arlene's life. Her father, worried about her safety, questioned the wisdom of a young woman moving to New York City alone. This touched the raw nerve of Arlene's frustration. She felt that her family didn't believe in her, that they saw her dream as a childish fantasy. Hurtful things were said, voices were raised. Arlene, feeling cornered and completely misunderstood, finally broke. "I'm done," she had screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm leaving this town and I'm never coming back." She stormed out of the yard, slamming the gate behind her, leaving a stunned, wounded silence in her wake. In the days that followed, anger hardened into a stubborn silence. The family expected her to cool off and apologize. It was the familiar pattern, but the phone never rang. A week passed, then two. Sheila called her apartment, and her roommate confirmed she'd packed a duffel bag the day after the fight, saying she was leaving and needed to clear her head. She never came back. In those first few months, the family clung to the belief that she had simply made good on her threat. It was classic Arlene, impulsive, dramatic, and fiercely independent. They pictured her waitressing in some diner in the East Village, too proud to admit she was struggling, too stubborn to be the first to call. Because she was an adult who had left after an argument, a missing person report was filed, but never treated with urgency. The police saw it as a family dispute, not a crime. But as the months bled into years, their justification began to feel thin. A fragile shield against a terrifying, unthinkable possibility. Holidays came and went, each one a painful reminder of the empty chair at the table. Their mother grew old, her health failing, her final years clouded by the unanswered question of her youngest daughter's fate. She passed away in 2005, her heart broken by a mystery that had no solution, whispering Arlene's name in her final days. The lack of an answer was a special kind of torture. It left no room for closure, only a vast, empty space filled with endless, agonizing questions. Sheila and her sisters were left with a wound that could never heal, each carrying a private burden of guilt over that last, angry argument. The story of Arlene Corrigan wasn't one of a dramatic, high-profile disappearance. It was a quiet, slow, and agonizing fade into nothingness, a tragedy defined not by what happened, but by the crushing weight of what was never known. Now, 34 years later, the world finally knew that Arlene hadn't run away. She had been taken. And her life story, finally being told, was now the key to finding the man responsible for ending it. Chapter 7. The Hunt Begins Anew. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of the Unsolved Crimes Unit, the pinning of a single photograph to a wall marked the beginning of a new war. The ghost had a face. The mystery had a name. The investigation into the death of the lady in the barrel was over. The investigation into the murder of Arlene Corrigan had just begun. For Detective Julian Hayes, this was the moment the case transformed from a forensic puzzle into a human quest for justice. The file was no longer cold. It was a living, breathing homicide case, and for the first time in 34 years, detectives had a ghost to chase. The central question was no longer, who was she? But the far more sinister question that had haunted her family for decades. Who did this to her? The first step was to build a life. The team needed to resurrect Arlene Corrigan from the fog of time, not just as a name on a report, but as a person who lived, loved, and feared. They needed to walk in her shoes, to understand her world as it existed in the summer of 1988. Their primary guide on this journey into the past was Arlene's sister, Sheila. Over long, difficult sessions in her quiet, sunlit kitchen, detectives sat with Sheila as she carefully opened old, dusty photo albums. Page by page, Arlene's world came into focus. There she was at her high school graduation, a look of defiant pride on her face. There she was on a family trip to the beach, laughing, her hair wild in the sea breeze. Sheila's voice, thick with a mixture of love and newfound grief, provided the color commentary to these faded images. She described Arlene's fierce loyalty, her habit of doodling on napkins, her love for the rain, and the quiet sadness that sometimes settled in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Sheila also provided the first crucial leads. She remembered the name of Arlene's roommate from the apartment in Springfield. She recalled the diner where Arlene worked, the Springfield Grill, and she spoke, with a palpable sense of unease, about the boyfriend, a man named Richard Peterson. She described him as charming on the surface, but with a possessive streak that worried the family. He would show up at the diner unannounced during Arlene's shifts, his gaze tracking her every move. He hated her talking about moving to New York, Sheila said, treating it like a personal betrayal. When Arlene finally broke up with him just weeks before she disappeared, he hadn't taken it well. Armed with this new context, the original evidence, so meaningless for decades, was re-examined with fresh eyes. Everything was brought out of the climate-controlled storage. The remnants of the denim jacket, the simple silver necklace, and detailed photographs of the barrel itself. Dr. Anya Sharma reanalyzed the forensic reports. The healed fracture on the clavicle was cross-referenced with a hospital record from 1981 that Sheila had helped them find, confirming a childhood bicycle accident. It was another definitive link, another thread tying the bones to the life. More importantly, Dr. Sharma's team, using modern imaging technology, found something the original examiners had missed. Embedded deep within the rotted fabric of the denim jacket were microscopic metallic fragments. Analysis showed they were a specific alloy of steel and nickel, consistent with shavings from a metal fabrication shop. It was a tiny, obscure clue, but for the first time, it connected Arlene's final moments to a specific type of physical environment. The barrel, too, was revisited. The old reports showed it was one of tens of thousands. But now, detectives could narrow their search. They focused on industrial suppliers and fabrication shops that were operating in the greater Springfield area in 1988. The list was still long, but it was a start. The simple silver necklace was shown to Sheila, her eyes filled with tears. It was a gift, she remembered, from their mother on Arlene's 21st birthday. The fact that she was wearing it when she died spoke volumes. It was a link to a family she had, in a moment of anger, threatened to leave behind forever. The team's primary focus now became building a concrete timeline of Arlene Corrigan's final 48 hours. They managed to track down her old roommate, a woman now living in Florida, who vividly remembered the day Arlene left. She confirmed the fight with her family had left Arlene distraught and angry. She packed a single duffel bag, saying she was going to stay with a friend for a few days to clear her head. She never said which friend. The roommate also confirmed the recent ugly breakup with Rick Peterson, mentioning that he had been calling the apartment constantly, sometimes hanging up the moment she answered. Detectives then began the painstaking work of finding former employees of the Springfield Grill. Most were scattered across the country, their memories faded by time. But a few remembered Arlene. They described her as a good waitress, quick with a smile, but quiet and reserved. And they all remembered Rick Peterson. They described his simmering jealousy, the way he would sit at the counter for hours just watching her. One former cook recalled seeing Rick's truck parked in the alley behind the diner the night Arlene disappeared. As the timeline sharpened, a suspect list began to form on the briefing room whiteboard. There were a few names, a disgruntled co-worker, an unknown friend she might have gone to stay with, but one name stood out in bold letters: Richard "Rick" Peterson. He had the motive, jealousy and rage from the recent breakup. He had the opportunity, he knew her schedule and her habits, and his behavior fit the profile of a possessive, controlling individual. The investigation, which had started as a search for a name, now had a new focus. It had a face. The question that now consumed Detective Hayes and his team was a simple one. After 34 years, where on earth was Richard Peterson? The hunt for Arlene's killer had finally truly begun. Chapter 8. The Ghost from the Past. Finding a ghost from 1988 should have been difficult. In the analog world where Arlene Corrigan had vanished, people could disappear with relative ease. They could move to a new state, pay with cash, and effectively fall off the map. But the world had changed. In 2022, every life left a digital footprint, a trail of breadcrumbs scattered across a vast, interconnected network of public records, social media profiles, and online databases. Richard Peterson had been a ghost for 34 years, but Detective Hayes was confident that he had left a trace somewhere. The hunt for him began not with pounding the pavement, but with the quiet, methodical clicking of a mouse. The name, Richard Peterson, was painfully common. An initial search brought up thousands of men with the same name across the United States. The team had to narrow the field. They started with what they knew: his approximate age, which would put him in his late 50s, and his last known location in Springfield. They began the slow, painstaking process of cross-referencing public records. They sifted through old property deeds, marriage licenses, and court records from the late 80s and early 90s. For weeks, every lead was a dead end. It seemed as if Richard Peterson had vanished just as completely as Arlene. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the Department of Motor Vehicles. An analyst running a deep background check found a 1991 application for a commercial driver's license filed by a Richard J. Peterson with a date of birth that matched their suspect. The address on the application was in a town just outside Hartford, Connecticut, less than an hour's drive from Springfield. And, crucially, the social security number listed on the form was a match. With that number, the digital floodgates opened. The ghost from the past suddenly began to take shape in the present. The trail led them from Connecticut to Florida, where Peterson had lived for a decade working for a long-haul trucking company, and then finally to a quiet, sun-bleached suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. There they found him. Richard J. Peterson, now 58 years old, was living a life of unassuming, middle-class anonymity. He had been married for 22 years. He had 2 grown children, a son in college and a daughter who was a high school teacher. He owned a modest 3-bedroom home with a neatly manicured lawn and a 2-car garage. He worked as a dispatcher for a local logistics company, a quiet, stable job. His social media profile painted a picture of a perfectly ordinary life. Photos from a family vacation to the Grand Canyon, posts celebrating his wedding anniversary, proud updates about his children's achievements. To the outside world, he was a devoted husband, a proud father, a quiet neighbor. But as detectives dug deeper into his past, a darker, more volatile picture began to emerge. They unearthed a string of minor criminal charges from the late 1980s in Massachusetts, just before and after Arlene's disappearance. There was a disorderly conduct charge from a bar fight, a restraining order filed by a previous girlfriend citing harassment, and, most chillingly, a dismissed assault charge from 1989. The details of that charge were sealed, but the fact of its existence was a glaring red flag. They also found his old employment records. In 1988, Richard Peterson had worked as a welder at a small independent metal fabrication shop in Springfield, the same kind of shop that would have used industrial steel barrels and where microscopic fragments of a specific steel and nickel alloy might be found. The pieces were clicking into place with a sickening certainty. Detective Hayes now had a suspect who not only had a documented history of jealousy and violence towards women, but who also worked in an environment that directly connected him to 2 key pieces of physical evidence. He had a man who, just months after his ex-girlfriend vanished, had abruptly moved to a new state and started a new life, leaving his past behind. The man in the smiling family photos from North Carolina was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime and only suspect in the murder of Arlene Corrigan. The ghost from the past had a name, an address, and a life built upon a foundation of secrets. He had spent 34 years, more than 100 seasons, crafting a new identity, burying the volatile young man he had been under the placid exterior of a suburban father. He had watched his children grow, celebrated anniversaries and coached Little League, all while the family of the woman he had allegedly killed was living in a state of suspended grief, not even knowing she was gone. The image of Richard Peterson, smiling contentedly on his back deck in a photo posted just weeks earlier, was a grotesque counterpoint to the image of Arlene's family finally learning the truth. Detective Hayes knew he couldn't let him live in that false peace for a moment longer. The time had come to close the distance, to bring the past crashing into Richard Peterson's carefully constructed present. The hunt was no longer digital. The next phase would be on the ground. Chapter 9. The Walls Close In. The quiet suburban streets of Charlotte, North Carolina, were a world away from the cold, dense forests of Massachusetts. Here, under a warm southern sun, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. It was a place of neighborhood cookouts, minivans, and the rhythmic hiss of lawn sprinklers on a summer afternoon. It was the perfect place to disappear, to bury a violent past under the soft, forgiving soil of a new life. And it was here that Detective Julian Hayes and a small, hand-picked team of undercover officers arrived in the late summer of 2022. Their target was a ghost who had built a fortress of normalcy around himself for 34 years. Their mission was to find a crack in that fortress. They set up a covert base of operations in a rented room at an extended-stay hotel just a few miles from Richard Peterson's home. The room was a mess of surveillance equipment, laptops, and styrofoam coffee cups. On the wall, they pinned a map of Peterson's neighborhood, his house circled in red. Next to it, they pinned the smiling, youthful photograph of Arlene Corrigan. She was a constant, silent reminder of the stakes, her presence a stark contrast to the mundane, suburban life they were about to infiltrate. The plan was simple, yet fraught with risk. Establish a 24/7 surveillance operation on Richard Peterson and wait. They needed to observe his routines, understand his habits, and most importantly, find an opportunity to covertly obtain a sample of his DNA. The first days of the operation were an exercise in excruciating patience. Richard Peterson was a creature of habit, his life a repeating, predictable loop. At 7:15 every morning, he would emerge from his front door, climb into his grey sedan, and drive to his job at the logistics company. At 5:30 in the evening, he would return. On weeknights, he rarely left the house again. On Saturdays, he mowed his lawn. On Sundays, he and his wife went to the supermarket. The detectives watched him from unmarked vehicles parked down the street, their long-lens cameras capturing a life of profound, almost boring, normalcy. They saw him wave to neighbors, take out the trash, and help his wife with the groceries. Hayes found himself wrestling with the jarring contrast. Could this quiet, balding man in his late 50s, this man who looked like any other suburban father, truly be the same volatile, violent young man who had been obsessed with Arlene Corrigan? Their mission was to get his DNA, what law enforcement calls a surreptitious sample. It had to be an item he had used and then abandoned in a public place, ensuring the chain of custody was clean and the evidence admissible in court. But Peterson was proving to be frustratingly careful. He drank from a reusable water bottle. He didn't smoke. He rarely ate out. The team's frustration grew with each passing day. They had one near miss when Peterson bought a can of soda from a vending machine at a gas station. An undercover officer watched as he drank it and tossed it into a public trash can. The officer moved in to retrieve it, but just as he reached the can, a city sanitation worker emptied the entire contents into the back of a garbage truck, crushing the one piece of evidence they had. The opportunity was lost in an instant. Days turned into a week, then two. The pressure from Boston was mounting. Finally, on the 15th day of the operation, the break they had been waiting for arrived. It was a Wednesday morning. Instead of heading straight to work, Richard Peterson's sedan pulled into the parking lot of a small local coffee shop called The Daily Grind. The surveillance team's radios crackled to life. This was it. An undercover officer, a young female detective chosen for her ability to blend in, was already inside, sitting at a small table with a laptop. She watched as Peterson entered, his face impassive. He ordered a large black coffee in a disposable paper cup and sat down at a table by the window. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. The undercover officer pretended to work, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her team on the coffee shop from 3 different vehicles outside. She watched Peterson sip his coffee and read the paper. He seemed calm, completely unaware that his entire world was about to be dismantled. Finally, he drained the last of his coffee, crumpled his newspaper, and stood up. He walked towards the trash receptacle near the door. The officer held her breath. He pushed the lid, dropped the newspaper and the empty paper cup inside, and walked out of the shop without a second glance. This was the critical moment. The officer waited exactly 90 seconds, an eternity in a situation like this, to avoid raising suspicion. She then casually stood up, gathered her own things, and walked towards the same trash can. With her back to the windows, she quickly pushed open the lid, her eyes scanning for the cup. She saw it sitting right on top. With a gloved hand hidden by a napkin, she deftly retrieved it, dropped it into her own bag, and disposed of her own trash. She walked out of the coffee shop, got into her car, and drove away. A block away, she rendezvoused with Detective Hayes. In the back of an anonymous minivan, The coffee cup was carefully placed into a sealed evidence bag. Hayes held it up. On the rim was a clear, wet impression from where Richard Peterson's lips had been. It was everything. The DNA that had been hiding in plain sight for 34 years was finally in their possession. The bag was labeled, sealed, and prepared for an overnight flight back to the state crime lab in Boston. As Hayes watched the courier's truck pull away, he knew that this simple, discarded paper cup held the power to connect the past to the present and to finally, after a lifetime of waiting, deliver justice for Arlene Corrigan. Chapter 10. Justice for Jane Doe. The flight from Charlotte to Boston carried a small, unassuming package that held the weight of 34 years of silence. Inside, the paper coffee cup was a time capsule, a bridge connecting 2 eras and 2 lives. At the Massachusetts State Crime Lab, the sample was processed with the highest priority. Technicians extracted the saliva from the rim and generated a new DNA profile. It was then compared to the profile that had been painstakingly rebuilt from the bones of the lady in the barrel. For Detective Julian Hayes, the hours spent waiting for the result were the longest of his career. The call came at dawn. The lab technician's voice was calm, professional, but the words he spoke were seismic. It was a perfect, undeniable 1 in a trillion match. The ghost from the past now had a definitive link to the man in the present. Richard Peterson was their killer. A week later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, the placid rhythm of a North Carolina suburb was broken as Richard Peterson stepped out of his front door, briefcase in hand, ready for another ordinary day at the office. He was met not by his usual quiet street, but by a semicircle of unmarked cars that had silently pulled into place. Detective Hayes, flanked by local officers, approached him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up his badge. "Richard Peterson," he said, his voice steady. "We have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Arlene Corrigan." The name hung in the humid morning air like a ghost. Peterson's face for a moment was a mask of confusion. Then, as the name registered, a flicker of something ancient and dark passed through his eyes. The mask of the suburban father dissolved, revealing the cornered, volatile young man he had buried for 3.5 decades. His wife emerged from the house, her face a canvas of disbelief as she watched the man she had known for 22 years being placed in handcuffs. The fortress of normalcy he had so carefully constructed had crumbled to dust in a matter of seconds. In a cold, grey interrogation room back in Massachusetts, the past and present finally collided. Richard Peterson, now in a drab prison jumpsuit, sat across a steel table from Detective Hayes. He was no longer the defiant young man from 1988. He was a defeated, greying old man. He began with a series of weak practice denials. He didn't know any Arlene Corrigan. He barely remembered his time in Springfield. He claimed it was all a mistake. Hayes listened patiently. He didn't argue. He simply began to place items on the table. First, a map of Springfield, with the diner and Arlene's apartment circled. Then, a photograph of the rusted barrel as it was found in the woods. And finally, a smiling, vibrant photograph of Arlene. "She was 23, Rick," Hayes said, his voice low. "She wanted to be an artist in New York." He walked Peterson through the timeline, the testimony of her friends, her sister, her roommate. He spoke of Peterson's jealousy, his obsession, and his constant presence at the diner. Peterson's denials grew weaker, his bravado fading. Hayes then laid out the science. He explained how they had identified her remains through forensic genealogy. He described the microscopic steel fragments found on her jacket, and how they matched the alloy used at the very fabrication shop where Peterson had worked. And then, he placed the final piece of evidence on the table, a photograph of the coffee cup. "We recovered your DNA from this cup in Charlotte last month, Rick. It's a perfect match to the DNA found on Arlene's clothing." A heavy, profound silence filled the room. Richard Peterson stared at the table, at the ghosts of his past laid bare. The fight went out of him. The wall he had maintained for a lifetime had been breached. He didn't offer a confession, but his silence was an admission of guilt more powerful than any words. The trial of Richard Peterson began in the spring of 2023. It was a case that bridged 2 centuries of forensic science. The prosecution, led by a sharp, determined assistant district attorney, methodically laid out their case for the jury. They presented the evidence from 1988, the barrel, the location, the motive of a spurned, obsessive lover. They then connected it to the present with the irrefutable power of 21st century DNA technology. The DNA, the prosecutor told the jury, was the silent witness that had waited patiently for 34 years to speak the truth. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Arlene's sister, Sheila, took the stand. With quiet, dignified grief, she told the jury not about a victim, but about her baby sister. She spoke of Arlene's laugh, her dreams, and the agonizing, decades-long void her disappearance had left in their family. Her testimony transformed the case from a collection of evidence into a story of profound human loss. The defense was left with little to argue. They attempted to claim the DNA evidence was contaminated, that the relationship had been a youthful fling, but they could not explain the damning confluence of motive, opportunity, and modern science. After a 2-week trial, the jury took less than 5 hours to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was electric as they filed back in. Richard Peterson sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead. Sheila clutched the hands of her family. Detective Hayes watched, his expression unreadable. The jury foreman stood and handed a slip of paper to the clerk, who read the verdict to the silent room. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the jury finds the defendant, Richard J. Peterson, guilty. A single sharp gasp broke the silence. Sheila Corrigan began to weep, quiet tears of relief and sorrow that had been held back for a lifetime. The judge sentenced Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ghost in the barrel finally had justice. Chapter 11. A Name Remembered. Justice, when it arrives after a lifetime of waiting, is not a joyous, explosive celebration. It is a quiet tidal wave of release. It is the sudden, crushing weight of 34 years of grief, uncertainty, and unspoken sorrow finally being allowed to break free. In the moments after the guilty verdict was read, Sheila Corrigan didn't feel triumph. She felt the profound, aching release of a burden she hadn't even fully realized she was carrying. The ghost that had haunted her family for more than 3 decades, the ghost of the unknown, had finally been laid to rest. Richard Peterson, the man who had stolen her sister's future and lived a placid, comfortable life built on a foundation of violence and deceit, would now spend the rest of his days in a world of concrete and steel, his name forever linked to the crime he thought he had gotten away with. But for the Corrigan family, the journey was not quite over. There was one final act of remembrance, one last wrong that needed to be made right. Weeks after the trial, they reclaimed Arlene's remains from the state, the same remains that had been exhumed as evidence for a nameless woman. This time, however, they were not evidence. They were family. They held a second funeral for Arlene. It was not the cold, anonymous affair from 1989, with a few somber detectives and a priest who knew nothing of the woman he was committing to the earth. This time, the ceremony was small, private, and filled with love. Sheila and her surviving sisters stood together, sharing faded memories and long-forgotten stories of their baby sister's fiery spirit and gentle heart. They spoke of her dreams of New York, of her infectious laugh, of the young woman who had been so much more than a headline or a case file. They returned her to the earth in that same quiet cemetery, but this time under the warm light of a late summer sun. The cold, impersonal granite marker that read Jane Doe 1988 was gone. In its place stood a new headstone, carved from polished rose-coloured stone. It bore her name, a name that had been stolen from her for so long, etched deeply for the world to see: Arlene Corrigan. Below it were the dates of her birth and her death, and a simple, loving epitaph: a daughter, a sister, a dreamer, lost but never forgotten. Sheila reached out a trembling hand and traced the letters of her sister's name, a final, tangible connection, a closing of a circle that had been left painfully open for a lifetime. The case of the Lady in the Barrel, which began with a grim discovery in a lonely forest, offered a series of profound and enduring lessons for our time. It is a stark reminder that in the vast, interconnected fabric of our society, no one should be allowed to simply vanish. For 34 years, Arlene Corrigan was a non-person, a ghost in the system, simply because her family, in their grief and confusion, believed she had chosen to leave. It underscores a crucial societal responsibility to create a system where every missing person is searched for with vigor and compassion, regardless of their circumstances. The assumption that an adult has a right to disappear cannot be allowed to become a shroud for violence. Furthermore, this story is a powerful testament to the role of science as a moral force for justice. The perseverance of Detective Hayes and the Cold Case Unit was vital, but it was the quiet, meticulous work of forensic genealogists that truly gave Arlene her voice back. They are the digital detectives of our age, sifting through the genetic code of millions to find the one faint echo that can connect a nameless victim to a family, a history, and a name. This case teaches us that investing in these technologies is not a luxury. It is a fundamental duty we owe to the forgotten. It is the ultimate expression of a society that refuses to let its ghosts remain nameless. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all comes from the life of Richard Peterson. For 34 years, he was a husband, a father, a co-worker, and a neighbor. He built a life, raised a family, and moved through the world cloaked in a veil of absolute normalcy. His story is a chilling affirmation of the banality of evil. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters do not always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they are sitting right beside us in the light, their darkness hidden behind a familiar, unassuming face. It reminds us that evil is not an external force that attacks from the outside, but a human capacity that can be hidden for a lifetime, a quiet poison that can corrupt an ordinary life. The journey to find justice for Arlene Corrigan was a marathon, not a sprint. It was a relay race of responsibility, passed from one generation of law enforcement to the next, carried on the silent shoulders of a family's enduring love, and finally brought across the finish line by a science that could read the secrets hidden in our very bones. It is a testament to the idea that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a way of rising to the surface, and that justice, no matter how long it is delayed, never truly vanishes. Thank you for joining us on this journey to bring a name back to the lady in the barrel and to close the final chapter in the story of Arlene Corrigan. Here at Afterlight Cases, we believe that every victim deserves a voice. If you believe that the truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Join us as we continue to shine a light on the cases where justice, against all odds, finally finds its way.